so let's look at one final problem involving the multiplication rule. So we're going to look at the following example. I have 3 officers that need to be chosen, and those are going to be a president, a treasurer, and a secretary. Are to be chosen from among 4 people. So those 4 people are Ann, Bob, Sid, and Dan. But there's some stipulations. So the first one is that Ann cannot be president. And either Sid or Dan must be secretary. How many ways can the officers be chosen? So ideally what we want to use here is the multiplication rule. So let's think about it. Let's do, here's a position for the president, here's the position for treasurer, and here's the position for secretary. Ann is not allowed to be president, so there's 3 choices for president. And then whoever's chosen for president can't not be chosen for treasurer. So now there's 3 options for treasurer. And secretary, it's either going to be Sid or Dan. So there are 2 options, so that's 18. So it looks like there are 18 ways, but I'm going to tell you that this is incorrect. Now remember, if we're using the multiplication rule, what we need to happen is that that one choice doesn't affect the other ones. And so really, to see that this is wrong, what you need to do is you need to think about a possibility tree. So let's draw a possibility tree for this. Okay. So I'm going to have my start, my root, and let's go with our president. So who could we choose for president? Not Ann. So there are 3 choices for president. We can choose Bob, or Sid, or Dan. All right, so now let's move on to the position of treasurer. So here, after Bob, there are 3 possibilities for treasurer, which are Ann, Sid, or Dan. Now from Sid here being president, there's only 2 options for treasurer, because remember, Sid or Dan has to be secretary, so Dan cannot be treasurer in this scenario. So there's either Ann or Bob. And then the same thing here. Dan is president, so then Sid would have to be the secretary. So again, there's only Ann and Bob here. So the last position would be secretary. So here, this first one, either Sid or Dan could be secretary. But here, Sid was treasurer, so then Dan would have to be secretary. Here, Dan was treasurer. So Sid would have to be secretary. Here, Sid was president, so Dan would be secretary. Same thing here. Dan would have to be secretary. And then Anne, let's see here, Dan was president, so Sid would have to be the treasurer. So, to count the number of ways, we just have to determine how many leaves do we have. So remember, our leaves are our terminal points. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the answer is 8. There are 8 ways to choose a president, treasurer, and secretary. So I do want to make one final note here about this problem, is that if you reorder the steps, you can use the multiplication rule. So you should first choose the secretary, then you can choose a president and a treasurer. So if we look, let's use our multiplication rule. So now we're choosing a secretary first, president, and a treasurer. A secretary, there's 2 options, and that is Dan or Sid. The president, well, you lose one person. Whoever was chosen as secretary can't be president, and also Anne can't be president. So there's only 2 choices here. And then for the final position, treasurer, whoever was chosen for secretary and president can't be treasurer, so there are only 2 options here as well. So then you get 8, and that's the total number of ways that we can select officers here. So you can use the multiplication rule, but you just have to change the order of steps here in order for it to work.